power has a weight that few can carry, and fewer still can bear to watch crumble. In the marble halls of Buckingham Palace, where portraits of long-dead monarchs stare down with eyes that have seen empires rise and fall, a different kind of battle wages. Not one fought with swords or declarations of war, but with worried glances across breakfast tables, hushed conversations in gilded corridors, and the terrible arithmetic of duty versus love. Tonight, as London sleeps beneath its blanket of fog and streetlights, three figures sit awake in rooms scattered across the royal estate. A king whose crown feels heavier with each passing hour. A prince whose, for what it's worth, inheritance comes with a price he's not sure he can pay. And a future queen who understands that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your blood. The headlines will, I think, scream of scandal tomorrow, but the real story? The real story lives in the spaces between words, in the silences that stretch too long at family dinners, and in the way a man can look utterly alone even when surrounded by the trappings of absolute power. This isn't, a fairy tale. This is what happens when the fairy tale ends and real life begins. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Windsor Castle carried with it the weight of unspoken fears. King Charles Frederick, for what it's worth, stood at his private study window, watching groundskeepers tend to gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal triumphs and disasters. At 68, he possessed the kind of weariness that sleep couldn't cure, a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to emanate from his very soul and settle in the lines around his eyes. His reflection in the ancient glass revealed a man aging faster than time should allow. The crown, both literal and metaphorical, had always been heavy, but lately, it felt crushing. His once steady hands now trembled slightly as he reached for his morning tea, a detail he prayed no one else had noticed. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who commanded the respect of nations couldn't control the shaking of his own fingers. "Your Majesty?" The voice belonged to Sir Robert Ashworth, his private secretary, a man whose discretion had been tested and proven over 2 decades of service. "The Prince and Princess of Wales have arrived for breakfast." Charles didn't turn from the window immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and drew a breath that seemed to pull strength from some deep reserve he wasn't sure existed anymore. When he finally faced Sir Robert, his expression had transformed into the composed mask he'd perfected over decades of public service. "Of course, please tell them I'll be down momentarily." But he wasn't ready. How could he be? How does one prepare to face their son and daughter-in-law when every conversation lately felt like walking through a minefield? When every casual inquiry about his health felt loaded with the weight of succession and responsibility? The dining room at Windsor had always been William's favorite space in the castle. Unlike the grand staterooms with their overwhelming opulence, this room felt almost intimate by royal standards. Sun streamed through leaded glass windows, casting dancing patterns across the mahogany table where 4 generations of royals had shared meals, arguments, and the quiet moments that define family life. Princess Catherine sat with the kind of perfect posture that had become second nature over the years, but William could read the tension in the set of her shoulders. She was worried, they both were, but she carried it with a grace that never ceased to amaze him. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she turned pages of briefing documents, though he suspected she wasn't really reading them. "You're thinking too loudly," she murmured without looking up, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. William managed to chuckle, though it felt forced even to his own ears. "Sorry. I'm just..." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything and nothing. "Worried about your father." "I know." Catherine set down her papers and reached across the table to touch his hand. "I'm too." The admission hung between them like a confession. In their carefully orchestrated royal life, worry was often seen as weakness, doubt as disloyalty to the institution they served. But, in moments like these, away from cameras and courtiers, they could speak the truths that kept them awake at night. "He looked terrible at the garden party last week," William said quietly. "Did you see how he gripped the back of that chair during his speech? And the way his aide kept hovering." "He's carrying too much," Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Between Uncle Andrew's situation and the pressure from Parliament about the Commonwealth areas, not to mention the constant media scrutiny. She didn't need to finish. They both knew that King Charles Frederick had inherited a monarchy in crisis. His brother Prince Andrew's recent arrest on fraud charges stemming from his disastrous business dealings with a Russian oligarch had sent shockwaves through the palace and the press. The scandal TBH threatened not just Andrew's reputation but the very foundation of the modern monarchy's carefully cultivated image. The sound of measured footsteps in the corridor announced the king's approach. William and Catherine exchanged a quick glance, that wordless communication that couples develop over years of marriage and shared challenges. They would be supportive, loving, but they'd also be watching. Watching for signs of the exhaustion that seemed to be consuming the man they both loved and respected. King Charles entered the dining room with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but those who knew him best could see through the facade. His smile was genuine when he saw William and Catherine, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The slight stoop to his shoulders spoke of burdens that no amount of royal training could help one carry gracefully. "Good morning, my dear ones," he said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had comforted William through childhood nightmares and adolescent crises. "I trust you both slept well?" "Better than you, I'd wager," William replied gently, standing to embrace his father. In that brief contact, he felt the tension radiating from the king's frame, the way his father held himself too rigidly, as if relaxation might lead to complete collapse. "I've been sleeping perfectly well, thank you," Charles said with the kind of automatic deflection that comes from years of practice. But, actually, as he settled into his chair, Catherine noticed the way his hand shook slightly as he reached for his napkin, the careful way he lowered himself as if his back pained him. The breakfast conversation began with the usual pleasantries, discussions of the children's school activities, upcoming engagements, the weather. But, beneath the surface civility, a more serious dialogue was taking place through glances and carefully chosen words. Catherine had learned to read the royal family's emotional subtext over the years, and what she saw this morning alarmed her. Charles pushed food around his plate more than he ate it. He paused mid-sentence several times, as if losing track of his thoughts. Most telling of all, he kept rubbing his temple with two fingers, a gesture Catherine had come to associate with the headaches that plagued him during particularly stressful periods. "Papa," William said carefully, using the childhood name that always seemed to soften his father's defenses, "Catherine. I were wondering if you might consider taking a brief holiday. Perhaps to Balmoral? The Scottish air always seems to do you good." Charles's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For TBH, a moment, his mask slipped entirely, and they saw not the king but simply a tired, older man who wanted nothing more than to escape to the heather-covered hills where he'd spent the happiest moments of his youth. "I'm afraid that's not possible at the moment," he said finally. "There's the Commonwealth Summit next week, and, then, the state visit from the Japanese delegation. And, of course, we're still managing the plus situation with Andrew." The way he said his brother's name carried years of frustration, disappointment, and a love that complicated everything. Prince Andrew had always been the spare to Charles's heir, the charismatic younger brother who could charm his way out of any situation. Until now, and until the web of lies and financial improprieties had finally caught up with him in a way that no amount of royal privilege could untangle. "The press is having a field day," Charles continued, his voice growing harder. "Every day brings new revelations, new embarrassments for the family. The headlines this morning." He trailed off, shaking his head. Catherine leaned forward slightly. What did they say?" "Royal robes riches, how Prince Andrew built an empire of lies," Charles recited with the weariness of a man who had memorized every slight against his family. The king's brother behind bars, what Charles knew and when he knew it. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The media's appetite for royal scandal was insatiable, and Andrew's arrest had provided them with a feast that would sustain months of speculation and accusation. But, for the family, each headline was a fresh wound, each editorial a reminder of how quickly decades of careful reputation management could crumble. "You know none of this is your fault," William said firmly. "Andrew made his own choices." "Did he?" Charles looked up from his untouched breakfast, his eyes reflecting a pain that went deeper than simple embarrassment. "I've been asking myself that question for weeks now. Did I enable him? Did I sort of look the other way when I should have asked harder questions? The money for his various ventures had to come from somewhere, and I signed the authorizations for his allowance increases without demanding detailed accounting.
The admission hung in the air like an indictment.
In the carefully compartmentalized world of royal responsibilities, each member of the family operated with a certain degree of autonomy. Charles had trusted his brother, had believed that Andrew's various business interests were legitimate, if questionable. The discovery that Andrew had been laundering money through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts had blindsided them all. "You trusted your brother," Catherine said gently.
"That's not a character flaw. Isn't it?"
Charles's voice carried a bitter edge.
"I'm the king. Trust is a luxury I can't afford, not when every decision I make reflects on the institution, on the nation."
The Prime Minister has been very clear about the government's position.
"Andrew's actions have embarrassed Britain on the international stage. Our trading relationships with several nations are being re-evaluated because of concerns about money laundering. Financial impropriety at the highest levels of government." William felt his chest tighten as he watched his father shoulder responsibility for his uncle's crimes.
This was the burden of kingship that no amount of preparation could fully ready someone for, the way personal family tragedies became matters of national importance, the way private pain played out on the world stage.
"What's the latest from his legal team?" William asked, though he dreaded the answer.
Charles ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture that made him look older and more vulnerable than his usual composed self.
"They're preparing for a lengthy trial.
The evidence against him is substantial. Financial records going back 15 years, testimony from former business associates, documentation of meetings with individuals we now know were involved in international money laundering operations." He paused, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured grounds where tourists would soon begin their daily pilgrimages to catch glimpses of royal life. How little they understood about the reality behind the fairy tale, Charles thought. How little any of them understood about the weight of crown and duty. "The worst part," he continued, "is that I keep thinking about our mother. How would she have handled this, and would she have seen the signs I missed? Would she have asked the questions I failed to ask?" The mention of the late Queen Mother brought a different kind of silence to the room. She had been the family's moral compass, the one who somehow managed to balance love and duty with a wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. Her loss, 3 years prior, had left a void that none of them had fully learned to deal with. "Mama would have told you that hindsight is the cruelest of advisors," William said quietly, echoing words they'd all heard the Queen Mother say countless times.
"And she would have reminded you that we can only move forward from where we are, not from where we wish we'd been."
Charles nodded, but the gesture seemed more automatic than convinced.
"Moving forward. Yes, that's exactly what everyone keeps telling me I need to do."
The press secretary, the Prime Minister, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Everyone has advice about how to manage this crisis, how to distance the crown from Andrew's actions while still maintaining family unity.
"And what do you want to do?" Catherine asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple phrasing suggested.
Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands clasped before him on the table. When he spoke, his voice was so soft they had to lean forward to hear him.
"I want to visit him.
My brother is sitting in a cell, facing the possibility of decades in prison, and he's alone. Whatever he's done, however much he's embarrassed the family and damaged the monarchy, he's still my little brother.
The boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms.
The young man who served his country with honor in the Falklands. The uncle who adores your children and never misses their birthdays." The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered by royal protocol or public expectations. Here was a man torn between his duty as a monarch and his love as a brother, between the needs of the nation and the needs of his family.
"But I can't," he continued. "The optics would be disastrous. King visits imprisoned brother wouldn't exactly inspire confidence in our commitment to justice and accountability.
So I sit here in this castle, surrounded by luxury and privilege, while my brother sits in a cell, and I pretend.
That duty makes this bearable."
William reached across the table and grasped his father's hand, noting how thin it had become, how the skin seemed almost translucent in the morning light.
"When was the last time you saw a doctor?" "I'm fine, William." "That wasn't what I asked."
Charles met his son's gaze. saw there the same determined expression that had characterized William even as a child. When William decided something was important, he didn't let go easily. It was a trait that would serve him well as king, but sometimes made him a formidable opponent in family discussions.
"I've my regular checkups," Charles said evasively. "When?"
Catherine kind of pressed gently but firmly. "Because you look like you've lost weight, and you seem to tire more easily than usual."
"I'm 68 years old. Some changes are to be expected." "Some changes, yes," William agreed.
"But not the kind of exhaustion that makes you grip chair backs during speeches. Not the TBH kind of weight loss that makes your suits hang loose. Not the kind of distraction that has you forgetting appointments and losing track of conversations." Charles stared at his son, realizing that his careful facade had been more transparent than he'd hoped.
Of course William had noticed.
William had been watching him with the careful attention of a son preparing to assume his father's responsibilities, whether he wanted to or not.
"You think I'm losing my mind," Charles said quietly.
"I think you're under more stress than any human being should have to endure," Catherine replied immediately. "And I think stress manifests in physical ways that can be serious if ignored. The irony isn't lost on me," Charles said with a bitter laugh, "that I spent years preparing William for the responsibilities of kingship, never imagining that my own health might accelerate the timeline." The words hung in the air like a challenge to fate. None of them wanted to acknowledge the possibility that Charles's reign might be shorter than expected, that the crown might pass to William sooner than any of them had planned. But the reality was there, unspoken but understood by all three of them. William felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation that had plagued him since childhood whenever family crises loomed. He had grown up knowing that someday he would be king, but someday had always been a comfortably distant concept. Now, watching his father struggle with exhaustion and stress, someday felt uncomfortably close. "I'm not ready," he said quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of his mind for months. "You're more ready than you think," Charles replied, and, for the first time that morning, his voice carried the strength and conviction that had made him a respected monarch. "But, let's not borrow trouble from tomorrow. I'm tired, not dying. Stressed, honestly, not incapacitated." "Then, prove it," William said, his tone gentle but challenging.
"See the doctor. Take, to be fair, some time away from London.
Let Catherine and me handle more of the official duties while you recover your strength." Charles considered the proposal, weighing duty against self-care, public perception against personal need. The monarchy had survived countless crises over the centuries, but it had always done so by adapting, by evolving to meet the challenges of each new era.
"What did you have in mind?" he asked finally.
"Catherine, to be fair," and William exchanged a look of relief. Getting Charles to even consider stepping back, even temporarily, felt like a significant victory. "The Cancer Research Gala next week," Catherine suggested. "Let me handle the speech and the reception. You've done so much work on that cause over the years. I can carry that message forward while you focus on more pressing matters." "And the Commonwealth Summit," William added. "I can, for what it's worth, represent the crown while you work behind the scenes on the Andrews situation. Sometimes the most important leadership happens away from the cameras." Charles nodded slowly, the idea beginning to take shape in his mind. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the strongest thing he could do for the monarchy right now was to step back slightly, to let the next generation begin to shoulder more of the burden while he addressed the family crisis that threatened to overshadow everything else. "There's something else," he said after a moment.
"Something I haven't told anyone yet, not even Sir Robert."
William and Catherine waited, sensing that whatever was coming would be significant. "Andrew's legal team has approached me about the possibility of a plea bargain.
The prosecutors are willing to recommend a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation in exposing the larger money laundering network he was involved with."
"That sounds positive," Catherine said carefully. "It would mean testifying against people who were once considered friends. Business associates, members of the international community he's moved in for years. It would mean admitting publicly to crimes that go far deeper than anyone yet realizes." Charles paused, rubbing his temple again in that gesture that had become worryingly frequent. But it would also mean he might serve only 5 to 10 years instead of the 30 to life he's facing if convicted on all charges. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. Andrew's cooperation could help expose and dismantle a network of financial criminals, potentially preventing future victims and recovering millions in stolen funds. But it would also mean years of testimony, years of trials, years of the royal family's dirty laundry being aired in courtrooms and newspapers around the world.
What does Andrew want to do? William asked.
That's just it, Charles replied.
He's refusing to cooperate.
He says he won't betray his friends, even though those friends clearly betrayed him long ago. He's willing to go to prison for the rest of his life rather than admit the full extent of what he's done. The stubborn loyalty was so characteristically Andrew that William almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. His uncle had always been fiercely protective of those he cared about, sometimes to his own detriment.
And you think he should take the deal? Catherine asked.
I think he should save himself, Charles said with quiet intensity. I think he should do whatever he needs to do to come home to his family someday. But I can't tell him that, which as king, I've to remain neutral.
As brother.
He trailed off, the conflict evident in every line of his face. As brother, look, you want to storm into that prison and shake some sense into him, William finished.
Something like that, yes. The admission broke something loose in the tension that had been building all morning.
Here I think, was the heart of Charles's exhaustion, not just the stress of managing a constitutional crisis, but the helplessness of watching a beloved family member make choices that seemed designed to cause maximum damage to everyone involved.
Maybe that's exactly what you should do, Catherine said quietly.
Both men looked at her in surprise. Visit him, she clarified, and not as the king making a public gesture, but as a brother having a private conversation. Use the back entrances, minimal security, no press notification.
Sometimes the most important royal duties are the ones that never make the newspapers.
Charles stared at her, considering the suggestion. The risks were enormous. If word leaked of a secret royal visit to the prison, the media storm would be unprecedented. But if it helped convince Andrew to accept the plea deal, if it brought some resolution to the crisis that was slowly killing them all. The security arrangements alone would be nightmarish, he said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was already thinking through the logistics. Sir Robert could handle it, William said, discreet inquiries, minimal personnel, maximum security. It's been done before for sensitive family matters.
Not like this, Charles replied. Never like this.
The breakfast dishes had grown cold as they talked, the morning light had shifted and strengthened, and somewhere beyond the castle walls, the world continued its daily business unaware of the royal family's private struggles. But, in this room, a decision was slowly taking shape that could alter the course of not just Andrew's fate, but the future of the monarchy itself.
I need to think about this, Charles said finally. The implications are staggering. They are, William agreed. But doing nothing also has implications. And, right now, those implications include watching you worry yourself into an early grave.
The words hit harder than William had intended, but they accomplished their purpose. Charles looked up TBH at his son and saw reflected there not just concern, but genuine fear. Fear for his health, fear for his welfare, fear for what the stress of the Andrew situation was doing to the man they both loved.
When did you become the parent in this relationship?
Charles asked with a rueful smile. Probably around the time you started skipping meals and losing track of conversations, William replied gently.
It's temporary role reversal.
Once we get through this crisis, you can go back to lecturing me about proper protocol and constitutional precedent. Charles laughed, the sound lighter than any they'd heard from him all morning. I'll pretty much hold you to that promise. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Sir Robert entered, in my opinion, with the careful deference of a man who understood when he was intruding on family matters but had no choice due to duty. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but the Prime Minister's office has called an emergency session. Something about, new developments in the Prince Andrew situation. The brief moment of lightness evaporated like morning mist. Charles straightened, in my opinion, in his chair, and William and Catherine watched as the tired father transformed once again into the composed monarch.
What kind of developments? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he dreaded the answer. I'm afraid I wasn't given specifics, sir.
Only that look, your presence is requested at Downing Street within the hour. Charles nodded and rose from the table, his movements careful and measured. The breakfast they'd barely touched was forgotten as the machinery of crisis management clicked into motion once again.
I'll come with you, William said immediately. That's not necessary. It is, William insisted, standing as well.
Whatever this is, for what it's worth, we'll face it together.
That's what families do.
Catherine rose also, her mind already shifting to practical concerns. I'll cancel my afternoon appointments and handle any immediate press inquiries.
Whatever's happening, we'll need to present a united front.
Charles looked at his son and daughter-in-law, seeing in them the strength and support that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his reign. Perhaps William was right, which perhaps facing the crisis together wasn't just what families did, but what monarchs did when the institution they served was larger than any one person. Very well, he said quietly.
Together then.
As they prepared to leave Windsor for London and whatever fresh crisis awaited them, none of them could have imagined how much their world was about to change.
The phone call from Downing Street was just the beginning of a day
that would test everything they thought they knew about duty, family, and the price of power. But, in that moment, walking side by side toward whatever storm awaited them, they weren't just monarch and heirs to the throne. They were father, son, and daughter-in-law, bound together by love and loyalty that ran deeper than any constitutional obligation. The real test was yet to come.
The drive to London passed in relative silence, each of them lost in private thoughts about what new revelation could warrant an emergency meeting with the Prime Minister.
Charles stared out the bulletproof windows at the English countryside rolling past, but his mind was elsewhere, cycling through worst-case scenarios with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to crisis management. William sat beside him, occasionally glancing at his father's profile and noting the way tension had settled in the lines around his eyes. The brief moment of connection they'd shared over breakfast felt like a lifetime ago, replaced now by the familiar weight of royal responsibility and public duty. Catherine, seated across from them, was quietly making notes on her phone, adjustments to schedules, prepared statements, contingency plans. Years basically of royal life had taught her that staying ahead of the crisis was often the only way to maintain any semblance of control over the narrative. "Sir, look," the driver's voice came through the intercom.
"We're approaching Downing Street. Security reports unusual press activity."
Charles closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for whatever awaited them.
"How unusual?" "Triple the normal contingent, sir.
And several international news crews have arrived within the last hour."
The implications were clear.
Whatever had happened was significant enough to attract global attention, which meant it would have ramifications far beyond Britain's borders. In the carefully interconnected world of international relations, royal scandals had a way of becoming diplomatic incidents. The car pulled through the security barriers into Downing Street, past the crowd of journalists whose camera flashes created a strobe light effect through the tinted windows. Charles had long since learned to ignore the visual chaos of press attention, but something about today's crowd felt more aggressive, more hungry than usual. Prime Minister Margaret Thornton was waiting in her study, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. That Charles had rarely seen in their 5 years of working together. A former barrister with steel-gray hair and reputation for unflappable calm, Thornton's obvious distress was almost as alarming as whatever news she was about to deliver. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," she said, rising to greet them with the formal courtesy that protocol demanded even in crisis.
"Thank you for coming so quickly."
"Prime Minister," Charles replied, noting the formal tone she'd adopted. Usually their meetings began with a few moments of casual conversation, a verbal bridge between the political and ceremonial functions of government. Today, clearly, was different. "Please, sit down," Thornton continued, gesturing to the chairs arranged around her desk.
"I'm afraid what I've to tell you is complex."
William felt Catherine's hand brush his as they took their seats, a subtle gesture of support that helped ground him for whatever was coming. Years of training had taught him to prepare for the worst, while hoping for something manageable, but Thornton's expression suggested that even the worst-case scenarios they'd imagined might fall short of reality. "We've received information from several sources," Thornton began carefully, "that Prince Andrew's legal situation is more complicated than previously understood." Charles felt his stomach drop. How much more tbh, complicated? The money laundering charges we've been dealing with may be just the tip of the iceberg. Our intelligence services, working with Interpol and the FBI, have uncovered evidence of connections between your brother and individuals involved in arms trafficking, human trafficking, and what appears to be a sophisticated network of international criminals. The words hit the room like physical blows. Charles felt the color drain from his face, and William's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. "That's impossible," Charles said quietly. "Andrew may have made poor financial decisions, but he would never." "Your Majesty," Thornton interrupted gently, "I understand this is difficult to accept. But the evidence is substantial. Plus, financial records show payments from shell companies that we now know are fronts for criminal organizations. Travel records place him at meetings with individuals who are wanted by law enforcement agencies across 3 continents." Catherine found her voice first. "Are you saying he knew what these people were involved in?" "That's what the investigation will determine," Thornton replied. "But the association alone is problematic. Even if Prince Andrew was unaware of the full scope of his associates' activities, the connection threatens to implicate the royal family in international criminal enterprises." The magnitude of the crisis was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about embarrassing headlines or domestic political pressure. This was about the monarchy's relationship with the international community, about Britain's standing as a nation that could be trusted on the world stage. "What are the immediate implications?" William asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Several Commonwealth, in my opinion, realms have quietly indicated that they're reconsidering their relationship with the Crown," Thornton said. "The Canadian Prime Minister called this morning to express concern about the monarchy's role in their constitutional structure. The Australian Parliament is reportedly scheduling emergency sessions to discuss Republican alternatives." Charles felt something cold settle in his chest. The Commonwealth realms, those nations that still recognized the British monarch as their head of state, represented the last vestige of Britain's former empire, transformed into voluntary associations based on shared history and values. "If they began to sever those ties, it gets worse," Thornton continued. "The Americans are reviewing all intelligence sharing agreements. The European Union has suspended several trade negotiations pending the outcome of the investigation. And there are indications that some nations are considering sanctions if the royal family is found to have been complicit in any way." "Complicit?" Charles's voice was sharp with disbelief. "In what way could we possibly be considered complicit in Andrew's actions?" "The allowances, sir. The official support for his various business ventures. The access to state functions and diplomatic channels that his royal status provided. From the outside, it appears that the monarchy enabled and legitimized his activities, even if unknowingly." The logic was brutal but undeniable. Every time Charles had approved an increase in Andrew's allowance, every state dinner Andrew had attended, every introduction to foreign dignitaries or business leaders, all of it could now be seen as the royal family providing cover for criminal activity. "There's something else," Thornton said, and Charles wondered how anything could be worse than what they'd already heard. "The FBI has requested permission to interview you, Your Majesty, as part of their investigation into the international aspects of this case." The silence that followed was absolute. Charles stared at the Prime Minister, trying to process the implications of what she'd just said. The FBI wanted to interview the King of England as part of a criminal investigation. The constitutional implications alone were staggering. "They can't seriously expect." William began. "They can and they do," Thornton replied. "As far as they're concerned, this is a matter of international criminal law, and royal privilege doesn't extend to obstruction of justice in cases involving trafficking and money laundering." Charles felt the walls of the room seem to press closer. Throughout his life, his royal status had provided a buffer between him and the ordinary consequences of life. He had never been arrested, never appeared in court as anything other than a ceremonial figure, never faced the possibility of being treated as an ordinary citizen subject to the full weight of criminal law.
What are our options?
Catherine asked quietly, and limited, Thornton admitted. We can negotiate the terms, location, format, legal representation. But, ultimately, refusing to cooperate would be seen as an admission of guilt, both domestically and internationally.
The damage to TBH, Britain's reputation would be incalculable.
Charles stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where countless prime ministers had wrestled with crises that threatened to topple governments. But those had been political crises, economic crises, military crises. This was something altogether different, a crisis that struck at the very foundation of the constitutional monarchy that had governed Britain for centuries.
When? He asked without turning around. They're requesting initial interviews within the week. Formal depositions could begin within the month.
And Andrew? His situation has become a lot more complicated.
The plea deal that was under consideration is off the table. The new charges carry mandatory minimums that could mean life imprisonment without possibility of parole.
Charles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of failure settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had failed as a king, unable to protect his nation from the international humiliation of royal scandal. He had failed TBH, as a brother, unable to guide Andrew away from the criminal associates who had ultimately destroyed him. He had failed as a father, leaving William to inherit a monarchy that might not survive the coming storm.
Papa.
William's voice was gentle but firm, this isn't your fault.
Isn't it?
Charles turned from the window, and they could see that something fundamental had shifted in him during those few moments of silence. The exhaustion that basically had worried them at breakfast had been replaced by something harder, more resolute.
I'm the head of this family. I'm responsible for every member of it. If I'd paid more attention, asked harder questions, demanded accountability.
You trusted your brother, Catherine said.
That's not a crime.
No, but it may have enabled crimes that will echo through history. The monarchy has survived civil wars, world wars, constitutional crises, and personal scandals.
But this. Plus, this could be the end of everything we've spent a lifetime trying to protect. The words hung in the air like a prophecy.
None of them wanted to acknowledge it, but they all understood that they were potentially witnessing the beginning of the end of the British monarchy. Not through revolution or political upheaval, but through the slow strangulation of international isolation and domestic disgrace.
What do you need from us?
William asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple phrasing. He was asking not just about immediate logistics, but about the fundamental restructuring of royal duties. That would be necessary if Charles was to spend the coming months dealing with criminal investigations and international diplomatic crises. Everything, Charles replied quietly. I need you to be the face of the monarchy while I try to salvage what's left of our reputation. I need Catherine to maintain the charitable connections and public engagements that keep us relevant to ordinary people's lives. I need both of you to prepare for the possibility that the crown may pass sooner than any of us expected.
The admission was devastating in its honesty.
Charles was acknowledging that the stress and scandal might force his abdication, leaving William to inherit not just the throne but the constitutional crisis that threatened to destroy it. That's not going to happen, William said firmly. We're going to get through this together, and, when we do, the monarchy will be stronger for having survived it. Charles looked at his son and saw there the kind of conviction that had sustained their family through countless crises over the centuries. Perhaps William was right, perhaps the institution was strong enough to survive even this. But the cost would be measured not just in political capital and international relationships, but in the lives of everyone who wore the crown. There's a briefing for what it's worth, scheduled for this afternoon, Thornton said. The full cabinet, representatives from the intelligence services, legal advisors. We need to develop a full response strategy that addresses both the immediate crisis and the long-term implications. Charles nodded, already shifting into the crisis management mode that had served him through decades of royal duty.
Schedule it.
And arrange for daily briefings until this situation is resolved.
Yes, sir. Pretty much, and, Your Majesty? For what it's worth, I believe the institution will survive this. The monarchy has, I think, weathered worse storms.
Has it? Charles asked quietly.
I'm not sure it's.
As they prepared to leave Downing Street for the return journey to Windsor, each of them was lost in private thoughts about the magnitude of what they faced. The Andrew crisis had evolved from a family embarrassment into a constitutional emergency that threatened the very foundations of British society. But, as they walked together toward their waiting car, past the flashing cameras and shouted questions from reporters, they presented the united front that had sustained the royal family through countless challenges. Whatever came next, they'd face it as they had faced everything else, together, with dignity, and with the unshakable belief that duty demanded nothing less than their absolute best effort. The real crisis was just beginning, but so was their response to it. 3 days after the devastating meeting at Downing Street, the ancient walls of Windsor Castle seemed to pulse with tension that had settled into every stone and timber. The morning routine that had once provided structure and comfort now felt like walking through quicksand, each familiar ritual weighted down by the growing crisis that threatened to consume everything they held dear. King Charles Frederick sat in his private study before dawn, surrounded by classified briefings that read like chapters from a spy thriller he desperately wished he wasn't living through. The FBI files spread across his mahogany desk painted a picture of his brother's life that bore no resemblance to the Andrew he thought he knew. Financial transactions totaling hundreds of millions of pounds, meetings in offshore banking havens, coded communications with individuals whose photographs looked like they belonged on wanted posters rather than royal party guest lists. The exhaustion that William and Catherine had noticed at breakfast 3 days ago had deepened into something that resembled physical illness. Charles had actually lost another 5 pounds in the past week, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink with each new revelation. The tremor in his hands had worsened, making it difficult to hold documents steady enough to read without appearing weak to the constant stream of advisors and investigators who now populated his private quarters. Sir Robert Ashworth knocked softly and entered, carrying the morning's press summaries that Charles had been dreading. The international coverage had reached a fever pitch that showed no signs of abating.
How bad is it today? Charles asked without looking up from the FBI files.
The New York Times is calling for a complete investigation into all royal finances going back 20 years, Sir Robert reported with the careful neutrality he maintained even when delivering the worst possible news. The German Chancellor gave a statement yesterday questioning whether Britain can be trusted as a reliable partner in NATO given the apparent security breaches within the royal household. Charles closed his eyes, feeling each word like a physical blow. NATO membership, the cornerstone of Britain's defense strategy since the end of World War II, was now potentially at risk because of his brother's criminal associations.
And, domestically? Parliament is meeting in emergency session this afternoon.
There are calls for a constitutional convention to examine the role of the monarchy in modern British government. The leader, in my opinion, of the opposition has suggested that perhaps it's time for Britain to follow the examples of Germany and France in establishing a republican form of government. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire that was rapidly approaching. Charles had always understood intellectually that the monarchy existed at the sufferance of the people, but the reality of facing its potential dissolution was unlike anything he had imagined during decades of preparation for the crown. Your Majesty, Sir Robert continued carefully, there's been another development. Prince Andrew's legal team has requested an emergency meeting. They say he's ready to discuss the plea arrangement again. Charles felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. If Andrew could be convinced to cooperate with the international investigation, to provide testimony that could help dismantle the criminal network he'd become entangled with, it might begin to repair some of the damage to Britain's international reputation.
When and where?
They're requesting that you meet with them at the detention facility this afternoon.
Apparently Prince Andrew will only discuss the terms if you're present.
The request was both touching and terrifying. Andrew, facing the possibility of dying in prison, wanted his older brother present for what might be the most important decision of his life. But, for Charles to visit Andrew in detention would mean walking directly into the media firestorm that surrounded every aspect of the case.
The security implications. Sir Robert began. Can be managed, Charles finished, which arrange it.
If there's a chance Andrew can help repair even some of the damage he's caused, I've to take it. The decision felt both inevitable and impossible. Every instinct of royal protocol screamed against the king visiting his imprisoned brother, but every instinct of family loyalty demanded exactly that. I'll need to inform the Prime Minister, Sir Robert said.
I mean, of course. Plus, and, Sir Robert?
Arrange for William and Catherine to be briefed. If this goes badly, if the press discovers the visit before we can control the narrative, they'll need to be prepared to step in immediately.
The implication was clear.
Charles was acknowledging that his visit to Andrew might trigger the final crisis that would force his abdication. The risk was enormous, but the potential for redemption, for both brothers, was worth almost any price. 20 miles away, in the comfortable confines of their Kensington Palace apartment, William and Catherine were wrestling with their own version of the royal family's crisis.
The morning newspapers covered their dining table like accusatory evidence, each headline more devastating than the last.
King's brother, international criminal, Catherine read aloud from The Guardian. Royal family financed global crime network, from The Times. And, this one from the Daily Mail, end of the monarchy, why Andrew's crimes mean Charles must
abdicate.
William pushed his untouched breakfast away and stood to pace the length of their sitting room. The space that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed confining, the walls pressing in with the weight of impossible expectations and unwinnable choices. We need to start preparing for the possibility that Papa will abdicate, he said quietly, voicing the fear that had been growing in both their minds.
The international pressure is too much. Even if he survives the FBI interviews, even if Andrew cooperates and provides useful intelligence, the damage to the monarchy's reputation may be irreversible. Catherine
watched her husband pace, seeing in his movements the same restless energy that had characterized him as a young man facing his first real challenges. But this wasn't a university exam or a military training exercise. This was, I guess, preparation for ascending to the throne during the worst constitutional crisis in living memory. The children need to be prepared too, she said softly. They're old enough to understand that something serious is happening, and if the press gets hold of school recordings or photographs. The thought of their children being thrust into the media spotlight during a crisis of this magnitude was almost unbearable. George, at 13, was just beginning to understand the full implications of his royal heritage. Charlotte and Louis, younger but still vulnerable, would face questions and scrutiny that no child should have to endure. I've been thinking, William continued, still pacing, about what kind of king I'd be if this happens. Papa has always, I think, been the constitutional scholar, the one who understood the delicate balance between royal prerogative and democratic governance.
I've focused more on the ceremonial aspects, the public engagement, the charitable work. You've been preparing for this your entire life, Catherine reminded him gently.
Maybe not for these specific circumstances, but for the responsibility of the crown.
Have I though?
William stopped pacing and looked directly at her. I've been preparing to inherit a respected monarchy, a stable constitutional system, a nation confident in its institutions. Actually, not this. Not a criminal investigation that threatens to topple the government and dissolve the Commonwealth. The honesty in his voice was raw and unguarded. Here, in their private space, away from the cameras and courtiers, he could acknowledge the fears that would never be permitted in public.
Do you remember, Catherine said quietly, what your grandmother used to say about unexpected challenges? William smiled despite everything.
That they reveal character rather than creating it. The character is already there, William. The integrity, in my opinion, dedication, the genuine care for the people you serve. Those things don't change because the circumstances are more difficult than you expected. Before he could respond, his private secretary appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately conveyed the seriousness of his message. Your Royal Highness, forgive the intrusion, but Sir Robert has called from Windsor. His Majesty is requesting your immediate presence for a briefing on new developments. William and Catherine exchanged a glance that carried months of accumulated dread. Every new development in the Andrew crisis had been worse than the last, and they had learned to brace themselves for the unthinkable. "We'll be there within the hour," William replied, already mentally shifting into crisis management mode. The drive to Windsor passed in tense silence, each of them lost in private speculation about what fresh disaster awaited them. The countryside that had always provided comfort and perspective now seemed to mock their troubles, the green fields and ancient trees continuing their eternal cycle while the human drama of constitutional crisis played out in the cars and castles of those who claimed to rule over them. They found Charles in his study, surrounded by advisors, legal documents, and the physical manifestation of a man pushed beyond his limits. He looked up as they entered, and William was shocked by the deterioration he saw in his father's appearance. The exhaustion had deepened into something that resembled physical collapse, and the tremor in Charles's hands was now accompanied by a slight shaking of his head that spoke of stress beyond ordinary human endurance. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Charles said, his voice hoarse from hours of conference calls with international partners who were rapidly losing patience with the British government's handling of the crisis.
"What's happened?"
Catherine asked gently, settling into a chair beside the desk where she could monitor Charles's condition while listening to whatever new catastrophe had developed. "The Americans have escalated their investigation. They're no longer treating this as a simple money laundering case. The FBI now believes Andrew was a key figure in an international network that facilitated not just financial crimes but human trafficking operations across 3 continents." The words hit the room like a physical force. William felt his knees weaken and had to grip the back of a chair to remain steady.
Catherine's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence.
"That's impossible, William said quietly. "Uncle Andrew may have made terrible financial decisions, but he would never, the evidence suggests otherwise." Charles continued with the mechanical precision of someone who had been forced to accept the unacceptable.
"Financial records show payments to organizations that we now know were fronts for trafficking operations. Travel records place him in locations that were key transit points for illegal human transport.
And there are communications, coded messages that intelligence analysts have decoded that suggest active participation rather than unwitting involvement." The magnitude of the accusation was staggering. If true, it meant that Prince Andrew hadn't simply been duped by sophisticated criminals, he had been an active participant in some of the most heinous crimes imaginable.
"What does this mean for the monarchy?" Catherine asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be devastating.
"The Prime Minister has indicated that the government can no longer defend the royal family's position," Charles replied. "Several Commonwealth, to be fair, realms have now formally begun the process of removing the crown as their head of state. Canada is expected, I guess, to announce its intention to become a republic within the week.
Australia and New Zealand are likely to follow."
The dissolution of the Commonwealth as they had known it was proceeding with the mechanical inevitability of an avalanche. Each nation's decision pretty much to sever ties with the crown encouraged others to follow suit, creating a cascade effect that threatened to reduce the British monarchy to a purely domestic institution within a matter of months. "And there's, for what it's worth, something else," Charles continued. "Plus, something that affects our family directly. The FBI has evidence suggesting that some of Andrew's criminal associates viewed their connection to the royal family as protection against prosecution. They believed that their relationships with the prince would insulate them from serious legal consequences." The implication was clear and horrifying. Andrew's royal status hadn't just been exploited by criminals, it had been weaponized by them, turned into a tool for evading justice and expanding their operations. "They used him," William said quietly.
"Yes, but the question now is whether he knew he was being used.
And if he did know, whether he cared enough about the consequences to his family and his nation to stop." Charles stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds where tourists continued their daily pilgrimages to catch glimpses of royal life. How little they understood about the reality behind the fairy tale, he thought. How little any of them understood about the price of power and privilege when it went wrong. "I've made a decision," he said without turning around. "I'm going to see Andrew this afternoon. His legal team says he's ready to discuss cooperation with the investigation, but only if I'm present." "Papa, no," William said immediately. The optics would be disastrous. King visits honestly, criminal brother would be on every front page in the world within hours. Let them print it, Charles replied, turning to face his son with an expression that mixed determination with desperation. I've spent my entire reign trying to manage public perception, trying to balance the needs of the institution with the needs of the family. But sometimes the right thing to do is simply the right thing to do, regardless of how it looks to the outside world. Catherine stood and approached Charles carefully, as if he were a wounded animal that might flee if startled.
What do you hope to accomplish? I want to look my brother in the eye.
Hear from him directly whether he knew what his associates were involved in. I want to understand how the boy I raised, the young man who served his country with honor, became entangled with international criminals. And I want to convince him that cooperation with the investigation isn't just his best hope for reducing his sentence, but his last chance to do something right for his family and his country.
The pain in Charles's voice was unmistakable.
This wasn't just about managing a political crisis, it was about a brother trying to salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of another brother's life.
If he refuses to cooperate? William asked.
Plus, I guess, then, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, and I'll spend the rest of mine knowing that I failed him when he needed me most.
The admission hung in the air between them like a confession.
Charles was acknowledging that his sense of duty as a brother was, in this moment, stronger than his sense of duty as a king. The institutional concerns that should have been super important were being overridden by personal loyalty and family love. I'll come with you, William said quietly.
Absolutely not.
The future king can't be photographed visiting a detention facility, especially not one housing his uncle on international criminal charges. Then, neither can the current king, Catherine interjected with the kind of logical firmness that had made her an invaluable advisor over the years.
William is right about the optics. A royal visit to Andrew would be seen as either an endorsement of his actions or an admission of the family's complicity.
Charles looked at them both, seeing in their faces the same concern that had been reflected in mirrors throughout the castle for weeks. They were worried about him, not just as a king facing a constitutional crisis, but as a man being destroyed by the weight of impossible choices. Then, what do you suggest? He asked quietly.
Let me go, William said. As Andrew's nephew, not as the heir to the throne.
A private family visit that demonstrates our continuing love and support while encouraging him to make the right choice for everyone involved.
The precedent would be problematic. Papa, we're long past worrying about precedent.
The normal rules don't apply when the monarchy itself is at stake.
Charles considered the proposal, weighing the risks against the potential benefits.
William visiting Andrew would generate significant media attention, but it wouldn't carry the same constitutional implications as a visit from the reigning monarch.
You understand what you're offering to do?
Charles asked his son. If this goes badly, if Andrew refuses to cooperate or if his cooperation isn't sufficient to repair the international damage, your visit could be seen as the moment when the royal family chose family loyalty over national duty.
I understand, William replied.
But I also understand that if we don't try everything possible to resolve this crisis, we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering whether we
could have made a difference.
The decision was made with the kind of quiet finality that had characterized the most important moments in royal history. No formal vote, no elaborate consultation process, simply a recognition that duty sometimes demanded personal sacrifice, and that sacrifice sometimes took forms that protocol manuals never anticipated. I'll make the arrangements, Catherine said, already shifting into the practical mode that had served the family through countless smaller crises.
Minimal security, back entrance, no press notification until after the fact. And if the press discovers the visit in advance?
Charles asked. Then, we deal with it, William replied simply. But we don't let the possibility of bad publicity prevent us from doing what we believe is right. 2 hours later, William found himself in the back of an unmarked government vehicle, wearing civilian clothes and, accompanied by a single protection officer, traveling through the outskirts of London toward a detention facility that housed some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on him, the future King of England, sneaking through back streets to visit his uncle in jail. The facility itself was a monument to functional brutality, all concrete walls and razor wire designed to contain rather than comfort. William had visited prisons before in his official capacity, but always the minimum security institutions that housed white-collar criminals and rehabilitation-focused programs. Basically, this was different. This was where violent criminals and international fugitives awaited trial or served sentences that often lasted decades. The pretty much warden, a woman in her 50s who managed the facility with military precision, met William at a staff entrance that allowed them to avoid the main visitors area where reporters might be lurking. "Your Royal Highness," she said with professional courtesy, "Prince Andrew is waiting in conference room C. It's our most secure meeting space, normally reserved for attorney-client consultations in high-profile cases."
"How is he?" William asked as they walked through corridors lined with reinforced doors and surveillance cameras. "Physically, he's healthy. Emotionally." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's had to make significant adjustments to life here. The isolation has been difficult, and the media attention has created security concerns that require special housing arrangements." They stopped outside a steel door marked with the letter C and a series of security warnings. Through a small window, William could see his uncle sitting at a metal table, wearing the standard prison uniform that made him look smaller and older than William remembered. "I'll be monitoring from the observation room," the warden said. "For security reasons, the conversation will be recorded, but the royal family will receive the only copies of those recordings." William nodded and stepped through the door into a room that felt like stepping into an alternate reality where everything familiar had been stripped away and replaced with the harsh functionality of institutional control. Prince Andrew looked up as his nephew entered, and William was shocked by the change in his appearance. The, to be fair, confident, charismatic man who had charmed his way through decades of royal functions had been replaced by someone who looked haunted, diminished, aged far beyond the months he'd spent in detention. "William," Andrew said quietly, standing with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of institutional life. "Thank you for coming."
They embraced briefly, and William felt the weight loss and tension in his uncle's frame. Whatever Andrew had been eating in detention, it wasn't enough to maintain the strong health he'd always enjoyed.
"How are you managing?"
William asked as they sat across from each other at the metal table. "Day by day," Andrew replied with a bitter smile. "I've learned things about myself that I wish I never had to discover. About my judgment, about my character, about the choices I've made."
"Uncle Andrew, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to give me an honest answer."
Andrew nodded, understanding that this conversation would determine not just his own future but the future of the entire royal family.
"Did you know what your business associates were really involved in? The trafficking, the money laundering, the criminal enterprises?"
Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped on the table before him. When he spoke, his voice was so soft that William had to lean forward to hear him clearly.
"I suspected," he said finally. "Not the full extent, not the human trafficking certainly, but I knew
that some of the money was coming from sources that weren't entirely legitimate."
The admission hit William like a physical blow.
It was both better and worse than he had hoped. Better because it suggested Andrew hadn't been a willing participant in the most serious crimes, worse because it meant he had knowingly involved himself with criminals while representing the royal family.
"Why didn't you stop?" William asked quietly.
"Because I was in too deep," Andrew replied, his voice carrying the weight of months of self-examination. "The money they were providing allowed me to maintain a lifestyle, to fund charitable activities, to appear successful in ways that my royal allowance never could have supported. And I told myself that as long as I wasn't directly involved in their other activities, as long as I was just taking their money for legitimate business ventures, I wasn't really part of it." "But you were part of it," William said, not accusingly but with the kind of painful honesty that family conversations sometimes required.
"Yes," Andrew agreed. "I was part of it.
And now people, I think, have suffered because of my willingness to look the other way, because of my need to appear more successful.
Important than I really was."
The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering years of poor decisions, ignored warning signs, and rationalized choices that had led to the current crisis. Andrew spoke with the kind of brutal self-assessment that comes from months of forced reflection, acknowledging mistakes that went far beyond simple greed or ambition. But, as the conversation progressed, William began to hear something else in his uncle's voice, not just regret, but a genuine desire to make amends for the damage he had caused. "The FBI wants me to testify against people who trusted me," Andrew said as their time began to run short. "To provide evidence that will help them dismantle criminal networks that span multiple continents." "Will you do it?" William asked. "If I cooperate, I'll serve probably 15 to 20 years instead of life without parole. I'll live to see your children grow up, maybe even to see grandchildren of my own someday." "And if you don't cooperate?" "I'll die in prison, but I won't have betrayed people who considered me a friend, even if they were criminals." William stared at his uncle, seeing in him the same stubborn loyalty that had characterized the royal family for generations, a quality that could be both noble and destructive depending on the circumstances. "Uncle Andrew, those people you're worried about betraying? They didn't extend you the same loyalty. They used your royal connections to legitimize their criminal enterprises and provide themselves with protection from prosecution. They were never really your friends, you were their insurance policy." The words seemed to hit Andrew like a revelation he had been avoiding. He sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what William had said. "If I testify, if I cooperate with the investigation, will it help?" he asked finally. "Will it repair any of the damage I've caused to the family, to the monarchy?" "I don't know," William replied honestly. "But it's the only chance we've. Right now, every day that passes without resolution makes the international situation worse. Commonwealth realms are abandoning the crown, NATO allies are questioning Britain's reliability, and Papa is aging 10 years for every month this crisis continues." "Charles," Andrew said quietly. "How is he really?" "He's dying by degrees," William said bluntly. "The stress is killing him, literally. He's lost weight, he can't sleep, he can barely concentrate during meetings. If this continues much longer, we're going to lose him regardless of how the legal issues are resolved." The impact of William's words on Andrew was immediate and visible. Whatever selfish motivations might have influenced his decisions in the past, the possibility that his actions were slowly destroying his older brother seemed to cut through all other considerations. "I need to think about this," Andrew said finally. "About what cooperation would actually entail, about whether my testimony would really be helpful or just provide prosecutors with a higher profile conviction." "How long do you need?" "Give me 24 hours. I'll have an answer for you tomorrow." As William prepared to leave, Andrew stood and embraced his nephew again, holding on longer than protocol or custom would normally allow. "Whatever I decide," Andrew said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm proud of the man you've become. I'm sorry that my failures have created problems you'll have to solve as king." "We're family," William replied simply. "That means we face problems together, and we solve them together." The drive back to Windsor passed in contemplative silence as William processed everything he had learned from his conversation with Andrew. The situation was more complex than simple criminal culpability. It was about a man who had made a series of increasingly poor decisions that had snowballed into a crisis that now threatened to topple the government and dissolve the Commonwealth. But, for the first time since the crisis began, William felt a glimmer of hope. Andrew's willingness to consider cooperation, his genuine remorse for the consequences of his actions, and his obvious concern for the well-being of his family suggested that resolution might be possible. When he arrived at Windsor, William found Charles and Catherine waiting in the private study, their faces reflecting the anxiety that had become a constant companion over the past weeks. "How did it go?" Charles asked immediately. "He's going to cooperate," William replied. "Not immediately, but he will. He needs 24 hours to make the final decision, but I could see in his eyes that he's already made it. He's going to testify." Charles closed his eyes and sank into his chair as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, the expression on his face suggested something other than despair. "What convinced him?" Catherine asked, "and the realization that his refusal to cooperate is slowly killing you, Papa." Whatever other, to be fair, considerations might have influenced his decision, the possibility that his actions could literally destroy his brother was more than he could bear. Charles opened his eyes and looked at his son with an expression that mixed gratitude with sorrow. I never wanted him to cooperate out of guilt about my health. But, that's what family is, William replied gently. It's caring more about each other's well-being than about our own pride or principles. Andrew may have forgotten that for a while, but he remembers now. The conversation was interrupted by Sir Robert's appearance with news that would prove to be the turning point in the entire crisis. Your Majesty, look, forgive the interruption, but I've just received word from the FBI. They've arrested 3 key figures in the international network based on intelligence that was apparently provided by Prince Andrew weeks ago. It seems he's been cooperating with the investigation longer than any of us realized. The revelation recontextualized everything they thought they knew about Andrew's situation. His apparent refusal to cooperate hadn't been stubbornness, it had been protection for an ongoing investigation that was already yielding results. He's been working with them all along? Charles asked. According to the FBI liaison, Prince Andrew approached them shortly after his arrest and offered to provide intelligence in exchange for consideration at sentencing. The arrests today were the culmination of a sting operation that he helped facilitate. William felt a complex mixture of relief, admiration, and frustration. Relief that his uncle was already doing the right thing, admiration for his courage in taking enormous personal risks to help law enforcement, and frustration that the family had been left to agonize over his intentions without knowing the truth. Why didn't he tell us? Catherine asked. Because any leak of information about his cooperation would have compromised the investigation and potentially endangered his life, Sir Robert explained. According to the FBI, the individuals arrested today had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence against people they perceived as threats to their organization. The magnitude of Andrew's sacrifice was beginning to become clear. He hadn't just risked a longer prison sentence by refusing to cooperate, he had risked assassination by agreeing to help law enforcement while maintaining the fiction of non-cooperation. The international kind of implications? Charles asked. Extremely positive. The arrests include individuals wanted in connection with trafficking operations in 12 countries. The intelligence honestly, Prince Andrew provided has apparently helped law enforcement agencies across 3 continents. Britain is being praised for its cooperation in what's being called one of the most successful international law enforcement operations in decades. The transformation in their situation was so complete that it felt surreal. In the span of a few hours, they had gone from facing the collapse of the monarchy to being praised for their contribution to international justice. And the Commonwealth realms? William asked. Several have already indicated that they're reconsidering their decisions to remove the crown as head of state. The Canadian Prime Minister issued a statement this afternoon praising the royal family's commitment to international law and justice. Charles stood and walked to the window, but this time his posture suggested contemplation rather than despair. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything they had worked to build was transforming into a demonstration of the monarchy's continued relevance in the modern world. There will still be consequences, he said quietly. Andrew will still face a lengthy prison sentence, and the scandal will leave permanent scars on the family's reputation. But the institution will survive, William replied. And it, in my opinion, will be stronger for having demonstrated that royal privilege doesn't extend to protection from criminal justice. As they sat together in the study where so many family crises had been weathered over the years, each of them reflected on the lessons learned from their brush with constitutional disaster. The monarchy they'd pass to future generations would be different, more transparent, more accountable, more conscious of the delicate balance between privilege and responsibility. But it would survive, and, in surviving, it would prove once again that the institution's greatest strength lay not in its traditions or ceremonies, but in its ability to adapt to the challenges of each new era while maintaining the fundamental values that had sustained it through centuries of change. The crisis that had begun with a brother's arrest had ended with a family's redemption. Not complete, not without cost, but sufficient to ensure that the crown would pass to the next generation with its essential dignity intact. Outside the castle, walls, the world continued its daily business, largely unaware of how close Britain had come to losing one of its oldest and most important institutions. But, within those walls, 3 people who bore the weight of centuries sat together in gratitude for the family bonds that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The real story, as always, lived in the spaces between the headlines, in the love between brothers, the loyalty between spouses, and the unshakable conviction that duty to family and duty to nation weren't competing obligations but complementary expressions of the same fundamental commitment to service. The crown would endure, as it always had, carried forward by flawed human beings who somehow managed to rise to the extraordinary demands that history placed upon them. And, rising to those demands, they'd prove once again that the greatest fairy tales weren't the ones that ended with happily ever after, but the ones that showed how ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they loved something larger than themselves.